The principal snatched the microphone mid-sentence, turned to the crowd, and sneered, "Deaf boys don't belong on stage." Gasps rippled through the auditorium as Elijah stood frozen, humiliated under the blinding lights. Behind him, his speech months of work lay crumpled on the floor. But in the row, someone was already uploading the footage, and what that clip would expose, no one was ready for. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The auditorium hummed with restless chatter as sixth graders filed into their seats, the smell of waxed floors and dusty curtains thick in the air. Teachers stood in the back, arms crossed, smiling too wide for comfort. It was the first school assembly of the year at Sterling Pines Middle School in suburban Tennessee, the kind of town where the neighborhoods looked identical and people said diversity like it was a brand, not a belief. And on that stage, under a blue velvet banner reading Voices of Tomorrow, 12-year-old Elijah Carter stood frozen in place, clutching a wrinkled note card in his trembling hands. He had rehearsed this speech for weeks. Every word, every pause, every breath. His mother Tamara had driven him to every therapy session, sat through every awkward practice, celebrated every syllable he pronounced clearly. And now, finally, here he was, wearing a faded red sweater and his best jeans, heart pounding, mouth dry, and eyes locked on the sea of curious whispering students. The microphone was adjusted to his height. The principal, Mr. Kenneth McLaren, gave a slow clap that felt more sarcastic than supportive as he introduced Elijah's name. "Elijah Carter, our newest sixth grader, has something to share," McLaren announced. "Let's give him our attention." But the moment Elijah stepped forward and opened his mouth to speak, the auditorium's energy shifted. His voice came out soft, unsure, a little uneven, shaped by the lingering effects of his hearing impairment. A few students snickered. A teacher near the edge of the stage grimaced. Elijah paused, his hands shaking as he clutched the mic stand. And then, in a moment that would brand itself across Elijah's life like a scar, Principal McLaren stepped back onto the stage, leaned in close, and took the microphone from his hands. "Let's not waste everyone's time," McLaren said, his voice amplified across the silent room. "Deaf boys don't belong on stage. Maybe next time we choose someone who can speak clearly." There was no gasp, no outrage, just a chilling stillness. And then, quietly, an eruption of muffled laughter from the back rows. Teachers averted their eyes. The staff didn't move. No one said a word. In Elijah's defense, Elijah's lips parted, but no sound came. He wasn't sure if his voice had abandoned him, or if the shame had simply drowned it. He turned his face toward the rows of students, some wide-eyed, others chuckling behind their sleeves, and then toward the exit sign glowing in red at the back of the auditorium. Every cell in his body screamed to run. Tamara wasn't there. She had picked up an extra hospital shift to pay for his new speech software. She had kissed his forehead that morning, told him how proud she was, reminded him he was meant to be heard. But now his story was being written by someone else. Someone who saw his deafness as a punchline. Elijah stepped off the stage slowly, face hot and throat aching. Behind him, the assembly resumed. A robotics club demonstration. A cheer team skit, as if he had never been there at all. But in the third row from the back, a woman clutched her phone to her chest. Her name was Mrs. Rita Mallory, a teacher aide, barely noticed by most. A quiet woman with long gray braids and tired eyes. She had been filming the assembly for the school's social media page, but when McLaren took the mic, she stopped uploading and kept recording. Her hands were trembling, heart racing, as she captured every second of the insult, every smirk, every laugh. She knew what she had just witnessed wasn't simply a moment of poor judgment. It was a moment of unveiled cruelty, and racism disguised as school discipline. After the assembly ended, Elijah sat alone on a bench outside the gymnasium, his backpack at his feet, head bent. His hearing aid buzzed slightly from the feedback in the room. A few students passed by, offering weak smiles or nothing at all. One boy whispered, "Better luck next time, talker," before disappearing around the corner. He didn't cry. Not yet. Not until much later. Inside the teacher's lounge, McLaren laughed with two senior staffers about the awkward little speech moment. He called it a teachable experience. They agreed, sipping coffee like nothing happened. Elijah had become another lesson in expectations, one that didn't fit the mold of their polished, performance-based school culture. That evening, Rita Mallory sat in her modest living room, watching the video again. Her husband, a retired civil rights attorney, stood behind her, silent and seething. "They'll cover this up," he said. "Just like they always do." But Rita shook her head. "Not if I send it somewhere they can't hide it." She didn't send it to the school board. She didn't send it to the PTA. Instead, she transferred the file to a secure drive and made a discreet call to someone she hadn't spoken to in years. Someone who owed her a favor. Meanwhile, Tamara returned home to find Elijah in bed, fully clothed, facing the wall. She sat beside him, brushing his curls gently. "Did you give your speech, baby?" He nodded once, stiffly. "Did it go okay?" Elijah didn't answer. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not until she got the call from another parent whose child had filmed the same moment from the audience. Shaky footage that made its way onto a private group chat where kids were already making memes out of her son's pain. Tamara saw her child's humiliation shared like a joke. Her hands trembled. Her pulse surged. And that's when her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number, with no text, just a video. She watched frozen, as the clip unfolded crystal clear with perfect audio. She saw the principal's face, heard his words, saw her child's face collapse, and then she noticed the timestamp. It had been sent just 15 minutes earlier. Beneath the video was a single line of text: "They can't erase him if we expose them first." Tamara didn't know who had sent it, but she knew one thing: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She stood up, walked to Elijah's room, and opened the door. But before she could speak, she saw him sitting up in bed, laptop open, headphones in, eyes locked on a speech video from a national contest. He turned to her, eyes wide. "I want to speak again," he said. Tamara blinked, stunned. Before she could answer, the doorbell rang. When she opened it, a small brown envelope had been left on her porch. No note. No return address. Inside, there was a USB drive, and on that USB was more than just one video. It held five different recordings of school staff, private meetings, and conversations about Elijah Carter. And at the bottom of the folder, a single audio file, titled "Removal Plan, McLaren Confidential." Tamara's hands trembled. The school hadn't just humiliated Elijah. They were planning to erase him, the special ed trap, and how it silenced him. From the moment Tamara finished listening to the recordings found on the mysterious USB drive, she felt the ground under her life shift in a way she could not ignore. The truth had not just drifted into her home. It had arrived taped inside her son's jacket and hidden in files she was never meant to hear. The next morning felt heavier, as if the air inside the Carter apartment carried the weight of everything Sterling Pines had whispered behind closed doors. Elijah sat quietly at the kitchen table, his cereal untouched, his posture stiff with a quiet dread that no child should know. There was a silence between them, not cold but suspended, like a fragile thread stretched across the morning. His eyes avoided hers, yet she could sense he understood more than he let on, that his school was not simply a place of learning, but a battlefield dressed as a hallway. Her decision to confront the school happened not in a burst of rage, but in a calm, resolute certainty. She arrived early, before the building fully woke, and requested a meeting with anyone responsible for Elijah's placement in special education. The receptionist gave her a strained smile, the kind reserved for situations that disrupted morning routines, and made a series of calls that eventually led her to a windowless conference room. The walls were off-white, lined with outdated motivational posters, and the air felt stale, as though the room held remnants of every frustrated parent who had sat there before her. When administrators entered, their expressions were practiced, polite, composed, but hollow. Their eyes skimmed through her, assessing instead of listening, already preparing explanations crafted to sound like concern rather than control. They informed her, with clipped professionalism, that Elijah had been placed in the special ed program on the day he enrolled because his initial assessments raised concerns. They spoke not of his hearing impairment, but of alleged emotional instability, of vague behavioral flags, of academic predictions rooted in assumptions rather than evidence. They emphasized that they had acted in his best interest, suggesting that he would thrive better in an environment tailored to his limitations. None of them acknowledged that no parental meeting had been held. No one apologized for bypassing procedures meant to protect children like Elijah from being mislabeled. They were comfortable speaking as though the decision was final and unquestionable, as if their signatures mattered more than his humanity. Tamara remained still, absorbing every word, fighting the urge to interrupt. Their language was laced with subtle dismissal, each phrase crafted to make her feel unfit to advocate for her own child. It was not new. She had heard that tone in hospital corridors, in rental offices, in places where black women were expected to accept decisions rather than challenge them. But something inside her had turned since watching that recording from the auditorium. She saw Elijah's humiliation replay every time she blinked. She saw the precise moment when his shoulders lowered, the way he withdrew from himself, the way the crowd's laughter became a wound. And she understood then that the school had not misjudged him. They had defined him without ever seeing him. When she asked for documentation proving that his placement had followed legal procedures, they exchanged glances. Their hesitation was answer enough. They provided her with forms filled with ambiguous phrasing, unclear test results, and vague notes that described Elijah not as a learner but as a problem to be managed. Nowhere did they acknowledge his hearing history, his years of progress, or the professional evaluations she had submitted during enrollment. Instead, the paperwork exaggerated shortcomings he did not have. His difficulty pronouncing certain consonants had been reframed as an inability to communicate. His timidness after transferring to a new school had been painted as emotional instability. Each observation had been interpreted in the least generous way possible, culminating in a conclusion predetermined by bias rather than assessment. Tamara felt her pulse rising as she read through the documents. She imagined Elijah sitting in classrooms he did not belong in, surrounded by materials that did not challenge him, guided by staff who saw him as a liability. She understood then why he had returned home each day quieter than the last. Why he lingered near doorways before entering rooms. Why his eyes dimmed whenever she asked how school was going. He had been placed into a category meant to limit him, not support him. The walls of that conference room seemed to tighten around her as she realized how easily systems could rewrite a child's future under the guise of helping him. Her next step was filing an official complaint firm, detailed and unflinching. She documented the lack of parental notification, the absence of proper evaluations, the inconsistencies between the school's claims and Elijah's medical records. She highlighted the violations in their IEP process, noting every moment administrators had fixated on his perceived deficits rather than addressing his documented needs. She expected resistance, and the school delivered it with predictable swiftness. They dismissed her concerns as misunderstandings, framing their misconduct as clerical confusion. They cited protocols she later discovered did not exist. Their statements felt rehearsed, designed to outlast the complaints of parents who eventually gave up. But Tamara did not give up. She pored over the IEP documents late into the night, studying laws, reviewing guidelines, and reaching out to networks she had never needed before. She found other parents whose children had been quietly rerouted into restricted programs. The pattern was too familiar to be coincidence. Misinterpretations of behavior, exaggerated academic concerns, culturally biased observations that turned normal childhood traits into diagnoses. Each story mirrored Elijah's in different shades, painting a portrait of a school that weaponized support to control visibility. As she gathered evidence, Elijah was fighting his own internal battle. He sat through classes where his potential was underestimated, surrounded by materials too basic for his curiosity. He listened as staff members spoke about him as though he could not hear. He watched the school shrink him into an identity he had not chosen. The worst moments weren't the ones he expected. It wasn't the tests he wasn't allowed to take, or the projects he wasn't allowed to attempt. It was the quiet moments when he raised his hand and was ignored, when he walked into rooms and felt teachers' shoulders tense, when his efforts were met with nods of sympathy rather than recognition. He began to understand that the system did not see him as a student to support but as a risk to contain. The shift in him was subtle, but profound. He grew more observant, more cautious, measuring his words and movements as though being watched. The recordings he gathered were more than evidence. They became his way of reclaiming control. Each whispered comment he captured, each conversation that revealed prejudice, each careless remark about his mother hardened his determination. He learned not only that the school doubted him, but that they feared what he could become if allowed to stand on equal ground. And then, one night, after reviewing the last of the recordings together, Tamara opened Elijah's backpack to organize his folders and found a torn note wedged between two textbooks. It had been ripped hastily, the top corner missing, the edges crumpled. She smoothed it against the table and felt a chill run through her. It read, "He's already showing signs he won't adjust. We need a long-term placement before she figures out anything." There was no signature, no date, no context, but she recognized the handwriting immediately. It belonged to someone who had spoken to her earlier that week, with a calm voice and soothing explanations. Someone who insisted they were advocating for Elijah's best interest. Someone who had lied to her face. As Tamara stared at the note, her breath caught in her throat. Someone inside that school was planning not just to limit her son, but to remove him permanently, before she uncovered the truth. and the torn edges suggested something else. This was only one part of a larger message. A message someone hadn't meant for her to see. The note, the lie, and the hidden microphone. It had been 2 weeks since Elijah's name was publicly shattered across the auditorium floor, but the ripples hadn't stopped echoing through his life. Sterling Pines Middle School carried on like nothing had happened. Teachers passed him in hallways without eye contact. Students still smirked when he answered questions in class. But something had shifted in Elijah, not just a wound, but a quiet rebellion. The USB drive Tamara had received, the audio files, and the surveillance whispered a deeper truth. His humiliation wasn't a one-off mistake. It was a system working exactly as it was designed to. It was on a rainy Thursday afternoon when Tamara found the note, crumpled in the bottom of Elijah's backpack beneath loose papers and a broken pencil. It looked like a scrap of routine school communication. But as she unfolded it and smoothed out the wrinkles, her hands went still. The handwriting was neat. Too neat. He shouldn't be allowed to speak in public. He's not mentally or emotionally capable. Recommend long-term exclusion from vocal assignments. It was signed clearly, unapologetically, by the school's own speech therapist, Meredith Langford. There was no mention of Elijah's hearing loss. No reference to his documented progress. No sign that the therapist had even spoken with Elijah directly. The language was bureaucratic but cruel. A pretext disguised as professional concern. Tamara read it 3 times before she realized she was holding her breath. Her pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't just disrespect. This was official defamation, recorded and stored like fact. She brought the note to the front office the next morning, demanding answers. But the receptionist gave her that trained smile, the one that softened nothing. An hour later, she was called into a private meeting with the vice principal, a school counselor, and the same speech therapist, whose name was printed at the bottom of the paper. They denied everything. The note, they claimed, was an informal draft, never meant to be shared. They questioned whether Tamara had found it at all. When she asked for a formal apology, they pivoted. When she threatened to go to the district, they reminded her that Elijah was already receiving extra support and suggested that his overstimulation may be affecting his memory. It was a tactic, cold and familiar. Tamara walked out of that room understanding one thing. If she didn't fight smart, they'd bury him with labels. That evening, Elijah stood by the kitchen table listening quietly as Tamara played one of the older recordings from the USB. The sound was muffled, captured through a closed office door, but clear enough to hear the laughter, the kind that comes not from jokes, but from cruel entertainment. A male voice mocked Elijah's stutter. Another mentioned Tamara by name, calling her too loud for a nurse. The staff members sounded relaxed, casual, unbothered, as if they were discussing the weather, not the future of a child they were supposed to serve. Elijah didn't flinch. He didn't cry. Instead, he reached for his school jacket, pulled it from the back of the chair, and flipped it inside out. He showed Tamara the small square patch near the hem, a tiny thread-colored square that looked like a stitched repair. It wasn't. Inside was a microphone, no bigger than a paperclip. He had placed it there 2 days earlier, after overhearing a teacher tell another student that some kids get too much attention for their problems. It hadn't sat right with him. He didn't know why, but something inside told him that whatever was happening behind closed doors had nothing to do with learning. Tamara stared at the mic in silence. Her son, 12 years old, half deaf, half ignored, had turned his school jacket into a witness. She wasn't sure whether to be proud or devastated. Over the next week, Elijah recorded everything. Hallway conversations, teacher breakroom chatter. The language wasn't always overt, but it dripped with implication. Phrases like "he's not leadership material," or "kids like him need firm discipline," echoed with dog whistles so sharp, Tamara felt dizzy listening. One teacher described him as agitated, when all he had done was ask to speak last in a group project. Another referred to his voice as distracting. Another questioned if his urban tone might create misunderstandings during presentations. It was all there. Racism without slurs, cruelty without confrontation. And it was worse because of its polish. But then came the bombshell. One morning, Elijah returned home early from school, pale and shaking. He handed Tamara the device and asked her to listen to the most recent file. It had been recorded inside a small admin meeting. The mic had picked it up through a half-open door near the nurse's office. The voices were calm, professional and lethal. Principal McLaren's voice came through clearly, discussing Elijah by name. He referred to the complaints as a distraction. He said it would be healthier for the school's image if Elijah's enrollment was reconsidered. Another administrator agreed, suggesting that escalating behavioral issues could justify an early transfer to a district-based alternative program. Tamara stopped breathing. They were planning to expel her son. Not for violence. Not for grades. Not for disruption. For speaking. For being seen. For existing too loudly in a space that had already decided what kind of black boys were welcome. It wasn't about failure. It was about removal. Elijah watched her from the doorway, face blank but eyes on fire. He didn't ask what they'd do next. He didn't need to. The answer was already forming in Tamara's mind. Cold and sharp. But just as she opened her laptop to email the district's equity office, her phone buzzed again. It was an anonymous text. The same number that had sent the original video of McLaren at the assembly. This time, it read, "You're not the only parent." Attached was a photo of 5 folders. Each one had a different name. Each one had a different black student's face on the tab. Each one had been labeled not viable. Communication concerns. Tamara's hand covered her mouth. This wasn't about Elijah. It never had been. It was about a system, one designed to silence. And somewhere inside Sterling Pines, someone had just opened the first crack in the wall. When social media turned against a child, Elijah's face was half lit by the glow of his laptop screen. As he scrolled through the video for the 100th time, the clip lasted only 29 seconds. A shaky handheld shot from the assembly stage, with tinny audio and distant laughter in the background. It captured the exact moment his voice cracked, his stutter thickened, and his confidence collapsed under the weight of eyes that didn't believe in him. In those few seconds, the video zoomed in on his face, red with embarrassment, his mouth moving just a half-second behind his thoughts, before abruptly cutting to Principal McLaren stepping in and taking the microphone from his hands. The video had been uploaded anonymously 2 days prior to a local meme page, then reposted to TikTok with a mocking caption, "When the quiet kid gets the mic." At first it seemed like just another cruel post in a sea of digital noise. But the algorithm didn't treat Elijah like noise. It treated him like content. Within hours, the video was shared by bigger accounts, overlaid with sound effects, captions, and commentary threads full of laughter. The internet had turned his trauma into entertainment. Tamara found out through a coworker who texted her a link during a late shift. She left the medication cart mid-round, locked herself in the break room, and watched in horror as the video auto-played again and again. Her son, a boy who had fought for every syllable, was now the subject of trending hashtags like mute kid fail and stage fright challenge. Comments rolled in like punches. "He sounds like Siri underwater. This is why they shouldn't let them do speeches." Pro trying to rap Morse code. But buried deep within the thread of cruelty was a single comment, simple, unfiltered, and shockingly direct. "That boy has power in his pauses. I've trained champions. I see something." The username was Victor Dane Official. At first Tamara didn't think much of it. She assumed it was a troll pretending to be someone important, using empathy as bait. But curiosity got the better of her, and she clicked the name. The account was real, verified, thousands of followers, and the bio didn't just confirm it, it underlined it. National Youth Speech Coach, 7-time regional champion mentor, keynote speaker, advocate for underrepresented voices. Her heart leapt. She tapped into the message inbox, unsure of what to expect. But Victor had already sent a DM. Short, respectful, and deliberate. He introduced himself, acknowledged the video, and asked if Elijah would be willing to join an open audition for the National Youth Speech Finals. He made it clear, not as a sympathy case, not as an exception, but as a competitor with potential. Tamara didn't know what to think. Part of her feared it was too good to be real. Another part knew this could be the exact disruption Elijah needed to rise above the noise. She waited until Elijah came home, showed him the message, and watched his face shift from disbelief to something else. Something rarer. Hope. He didn't speak much that evening. He simply nodded, took out his speech notebook, and began writing again. But hope is dangerous in places designed to crush it. 2 days later, Tamara received an official letter from Sterling Pines Middle School. It was curt, clinical, and chilling. It stated that Elijah was not permitted to participate in any off-campus academic contests without prior district approval. It cited concerns regarding his emotional readiness and communication reliability, and reminded her that his individualized education plan, IEEP, prioritized nonverbal accommodations over public expression. It was their way of saying no, without using the word. Victor responded with a fire Tamara hadn't expected. He reached out to the district directly, requested Elijah's IEP, and offered to fund a private assessment through an independent speech specialist. His email was firm but professional. It called out coded language, outlined legal statutes protecting disabled students' right to equal academic opportunities, and offered documentation of Elijah's progress. The school remained silent, but the damage had already begun to take new shape. Someone, anonymous but clearly connected to school staff, leaked Elijah's special education status to a local gossip blog. The blog spun it into a hit piece. Sterling Pine's mom pushes disabled son into national contest. It questioned Tamara's parenting. It suggested Elijah was being paraded as a political statement. The comment section lit up again, uglier this time. Some accused her of playing the race card, others of forcing a broken kid into the spotlight. The school, of course, denied involvement. But Tamara saw the pattern. Every time Elijah rose, someone moved the ceiling lower. Victor wasn't done. He posted a public message across his platforms, tactful, strategic, but impossible to ignore. He didn't name Elijah, but he described the situation: a gifted, partially deaf black student blocked from a speech opportunity by systemic bias. The post went viral. Parents across the country began sharing their own stories of discrimination buried in paperwork. Advocates offered support. Lawyers reached out. And that's when something strange happened. Another video surfaced, not of Elijah, but of a different child. A white student from the same school, participating in a statewide STEM fair without prior district approval. In the clip, Principal McLaren stood proudly beside him, smiling for the camera, hands on the boy's shoulders. The caption was cutting: "No emotional readiness concerns here." Tamara didn't post it. Victor didn't post it. The source was unknown, but its message spread fast. Suddenly, the school had a spotlight it didn't want. Tamara began receiving cryptic emails from teachers she didn't know, thanking her quietly, anonymously, for speaking up. One message simply said, "You're shaking the right tree." But even as support grew, the pushback grew darker. Late one night, Elijah's Chromebook was remotely locked by the district IT system. When it rebooted, the speech draft he had been working on, weeks of work, was gone, deleted. No backups. The tech department claimed it was a routine software update. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He wrote it again. And this time it was sharper. He wrote not about being voiceless, but about what it felt like to be heard and ignored. He wrote about silence as a weapon, not his own, but the kind used by people in power to pretend neutrality. He titled the new piece, "The Pause is Where the Truth Lives." Victor read it and said nothing for a long time. Then he printed it, slid it into a folder, and said it was ready. But the school had one more play. The day before Elijah's official submission to the contest, Tamara received a certified letter at her doorstep. It warned that if Elijah represented the school or wore any clothing identifying Sterling Pines during the contest, it would be considered a violation of district policy. They couldn't stop him from competing, but they could erase their name from his story. They were willing to sever all ties just to avoid accountability. Tamara read the letter twice, then folded it in half, and placed it in her purse. She would not let this place define her son. The next morning, Victor submitted Elijah's application, using an independent entry form, backed by a national advocacy nonprofit. No school affiliation, no endorsements. Just Elijah Carter, speaker. The final line of the submission read, "Applicant competes under independent representation due to school district refusal." It was approved within 6 hours. Elijah was officially accepted into the National Youth Speech Finals. But that evening, as Tamara stepped out to grab a package from the porch, she found something else instead. An envelope. No postage. No return address. Inside, a printed letter, district letterhead. It wasn't about the contest. It was about Elijah's disciplinary record. They were calling for a full behavioral evaluation based on escalating concerns. And the final line of the letter chilled her to the bone. Pending the results of this evaluation, permanent expulsion may be considered. They couldn't stop him from speaking, so now they wanted to make sure he'd never speak at school again. Sabotaged, the day they canceled his application. The morning after the district's threatening letter arrived, the Carter apartment felt like it was holding its breath. Even the sunlight creeping through the blinds seemed hesitant, dimmed by the weight of what had been implied, that Elijah's place in school, his right to learn, to speak, to be seen, could be stripped away under the guise of procedure. Elijah sat at the table with his speech draft in hand, reading over the lines he had rewritten after the school wiped his Chromebook. There was resilience in the way he studied each sentence, as though every word was a step forward, a refusal to be pushed back into silence. But beneath that determination lived a quiet fear that had taken root long before the videos went viral, long before the note in his backpack. It was the fear of being erased. Tamara watched him from across the room, trying to read what he wasn't saying. She recognized the stillness in his shoulders, the way he held his breath each time he read a difficult line, as if bracing for an invisible critic. She wished she could lift the burden off his chest, but the fight they were in required clarity, not comfort. The district had made its intentions painfully clear. The school was not simply protecting itself, it was preparing for retaliation. The timing of the behavioral evaluation request was too deliberate, too aligned with Elijah's acceptance into the national contest to be coincidence. She took his backpack to check for more notes, or irregularities. That was when she saw the envelope. Thin, official, addressed to her son. The school seal was stamped in the upper corner, and inside she found a letter printed in cold mechanical language. It stated outright that Elijah's application to compete in the National Youth Speech Finals had been rejected, not by the contest board, but by Sterling Pines Middle School itself. According to the letter, the school had reviewed his psychological records and determined he was not mentally fit to represent the institution in public forums. They claimed his participation could misrepresent the district's standards of academic readiness. Tamara felt her stomach drop. There had been no evaluation, no consultation, no official testing, just a document filled with fabricated assessments she had never seen before. Claims of emotional instability, academic shortfalls, and behavioral unpredictability, all signed by individuals she had never even met. The language echoed the tone used during their earlier meeting, polished, professional, and profoundly discriminatory. It created a portrait of her son that did not exist, one designed to disqualify him from opportunity rather than support his growth. Elijah looked up when he sensed her stillness, and saw the paper trembling in her hand. Even without reading it, he seemed to understand. His expression didn't crack, but something behind his eyes flickered, an exhaustion far too heavy for someone his age. He had suspected they would retaliate, yet the speed and calculation of the sabotage struck him with a quiet devastation. The school had spoken for him, rewritten his identity with ink and signatures, and tried to close the door on his future before he had taken a single step onto the national stage. Tamara moved immediately. She sent the letter to Victor, who responded within minutes, urging her to save every page. Within the hour, he arranged a virtual meeting, connecting her with a civil rights attorney he knew, a woman named Marlene Whitaker, known for dismantling discriminatory school policies across the Southeast. Before the meeting began, Tamara took a moment to gather herself. She looked at Elijah, seated beside her with his notebook on his lap, back straight despite everything. She felt a renewed fire in her chest as she realized they were no longer simply fighting for his speech contest. They were fighting for the legitimacy of his voice altogether. When the call started, Marlene listened with an intensity that felt different from the responses Tamara had received from school officials. She did not interrupt. She did not doubt. She asked precise questions about dates, documents, evaluations, and every inconsistency Tamara had found in the school's claims. With each answer, her brow tightened. She walked them through the legal framework of educational rights, explaining that a school cannot fabricate psychological assessments, nor restrict extracurricular participation based on disability, nor retaliate when parents file complaint. Each violation she listed only deepened the sinking realization that Sterling Pines had crossed far more lines than Tamara had initially understood. Marlene requested copies of Elijah's IEP, attendance logs, behavioral notes, and every piece of correspondence between the Carters and the school. When Tamara sent photos of the torn note found in Elijah's backpack, the attorney went still for a moment, then instructed them to preserve it carefully. The handwriting, the phrasing, the context, it all pointed toward unlawful premeditation. What Tamara had feared was not paranoia, it was evident. But the most shocking moment came when Marlene reviewed the forged psychological documents the school had used to block Elijah's contest application. She studied each signature, cross-referenced the listed evaluators, then leaned back as realization washed over her. According to her research, several of the names printed on Elijah's alleged assessment had been retired for years. Others did not specialize in child psychology at all, and one, perhaps the most incriminating, was listed as deceased. The school had manufactured an entire evaluation using names that no longer existed in the system. Tamara felt the air leave her lungs. Elijah stared at the screen with wide eyes, as if struggling to grasp how adults entrusted with his well-being could commit a deception so elaborate, so reckless. The sabotage wasn't sloppy. It was strategic. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a constructed barrier meant to silence him permanently. Marlene's voice remained steady as she explained the next steps. With evidence of forged documentation, discriminatory placement, and retaliatory action, they had grounds not just for a complaint, but for a formal investigation at the district and federal level. She advised them to prepare for resistance, for attempts to reframe the narrative. But she also assured them that the law was on Elijah's side. She would take the case pro bono, not out of charity, but because she believed the school had crossed a line that demanded accountability. After the call, the apartment felt heavy with a mixture of relief, outrage, and apprehension. Elijah sat quietly, analyzing the moment with an unusual maturity. He now understood that the school's cruelty wasn't random, it was systemic. Adults had not simply doubted him, they had collaborated to erase him. Yet beneath the hurt, there was something else simmering, a sense of purpose that had been born the moment he realized the truth about their lies. Tamara began gathering every scrap of paperwork she could find. She organized files late into the night, aligning timelines, recording details, assembling the story the school had tried to bury. She paused only when she noticed something on the district portal, an archived section of old disciplinary logs. Curiosity led her to dig deeper, cross-referencing names mentioned during the earlier recordings on Elijah's microphone. That was when she discovered it. Over the last 10 years, dozens of minority students, mostly black boys, had been quietly funneled into special ed, under similarly vague assessments, all signed by the same handful of staff members. Many had left the school, some had transferred mid-year. Records showed patterns that mirrored Elijah's experience, so closely it made Tamara's hands tremble. The final entry she clicked froze her in place. A boy, aged 13, removed from public competitions due to a mental unfitness evaluation. The evaluator's signature was identical to the one on Elijah's forged assessment, yet the evaluator had been dead for 4 years before Elijah enrolled. This was no isolated act. It was a decade-long system, and someone had just handed them the thread needed to unravel it all. A pattern of silence, and the other victims. The moment Marlene uncovered the memo bearing Principal McLaren's initials, marking minority students for restricted participation, a new current surged through the case. Up until that point, everything had orbited around Elijah, his humiliation, his sabotage, his fight for the right to speak. But now the evidence stretched beyond one child. It widened into a pattern, a chilling map of educational exclusion, built over years, protected by silence, and hidden beneath layers of red tape and polite policy language. What had felt personal now looked systemic, and disturbingly intentional. Tamara didn't sleep the night that memo was uncovered. The walls of her apartment no longer felt like protection, but like barriers to something bigger she hadn't seen coming. She stared at the documents spread across her kitchen table. Elijah's IEP, the rejection letter, the falsified psychological forms, and realized they were only pieces of a much older machine. If this had happened to others before, then Elijah's fight wasn't just about proving the truth. It was about opening a door that had stayed closed for far too long. Victor sensed the shift too. He activated contacts across state education forums and former school employees, asking quiet questions that carried loud implications. Within days, responses trickled in. Some hesitant, some furious, some filled with regret. The most telling came from former students now in high school or early college, each one echoing parts of Elijah's story in different shades. One had been pulled from a regional debate team after an IEP revision. Another recalled being told her accent made her too hard to understand. A boy with a stutter was reassigned to janitorial duty during school assemblies despite being top of his class. Their names had been buried, their records rewritten to match narratives that placed the blame on them, not the institution. Marlene began compiling their stories into affidavits. The trend was impossible to ignore. Over the past 10 years, at least 5 black students, each showing interest or talent in public speaking, had been labeled unfit by the school's evaluation system. Not for academic failure, not for misconduct, but for communication irregularities, emotional unpreparedness, or speech clarity concerns. And in every case, a teacher or administrator had suggested redirection, a term that now reeked of institutional code for silence. The more Marlene dug, the clearer the strategy became. Sterling Pines didn't use slurs or public punishments. It used structure. It used bureaucracy. It weaponized IEPs and concerns to quietly reroute black excellence away from visibility. It didn't block ambition outright. It strangled it behind closed doors, documenting it in files few parents ever knew existed. But it was the interview with a retired language arts teacher named Dolores Finch that changed everything. She had worked at Sterling Pines for over 15 years and had retired 3 years prior, citing philosophical differences with new leadership. When Victor contacted her, she didn't hesitate. She remembered Elijah's name immediately, not because she had taught him, but because she'd seen his pattern unfold before. Her voice shook during the interview, not with fear but with the guilt of someone who had watched too much in silence. Dolores explained how, under McLaren's administration, subtle instructions were passed down during staff meetings. Teachers were advised to identify early which students showed potential for public-facing roles and which did not. The criteria were never written, never formal, but they were clear. Students who were white, well-spoken in a specific tone, and came from stable homes were encouraged. Others, particularly those with speech challenges, cultural dialects, or behavioral flags, were quietly redirected toward alternative strengths, and those alternative strengths almost always meant physical labor, sports, or support roles. Not visibility, not leadership, not voice. Dolores admitted she had pushed back once, when a talented student named Marcus, a black 7th grader with a thick Southern drawl, was denied entry into a district speech showcase. He had written one of the most powerful essays she had ever read, but the administration insisted his delivery style would be misunderstood by judges. Instead, he was assigned to help with stage setup. When Dolores argued that he deserved a spot, she was told plainly that not every student is made for a microphone. She never forgot that sentence. Tamara listened as Victor relayed every word. Each new revelation struck like a blow, not just as a mother but as a woman who had trusted that relocating to this town, this district, would offer Elijah more opportunity, not less. Now she understood what she had walked into. Sterling Pines hadn't failed her son. It had planned for him to fail, and yet nothing prepared her for what Dolores did next. At the end of the call, she requested to meet in person. Tamara, Victor, and Marlene arrived the following morning to Dolores's modest home, where sunlight spilled gently through sheer curtains. She greeted them with a soft urgency, like someone who had waited years to tell a secret but needed to be sure the right people heard it. She led them into her living room, opened a worn file box, and removed a folder marked only with the year. Inside were photos, handwritten notes, and copies of disciplinary reports that had never made it into official files. Dolores had kept them all. The students' names were redacted with care, but their stories were unmistakable. A girl assigned extra reading tasks during recess for being too expressive. A boy reprimanded for overusing hand gestures during a book presentation. Notes from meetings where teachers questioned whether certain students of color would fit the district's representation goal. But the most damning piece sat at the bottom. It was a CD. Dolores placed it on the table, without ceremony, as though the weight of what it contained had worn her down. She explained that it had been recorded during a staff training session held years ago, a session not open to parents or students, labeled Internal Strategy Alignment. Victor borrowed a portable disc player from the trunk of his car. When the CD spun and the audio filled the room, no one spoke. The voice on the recording was unmistakable. Principal McLaren. He was speaking casually, almost jokingly, to a room of educators, discussing branding strategy and how every school has its type. He said Sterling Pines needed to present a polished image of excellence and couldn't afford representation complications. He went on to reference past mismatches, claiming that certain students hurt the school's upward trajectory. The line that followed turned Tamara's stomach. If we want to stay competitive, we can't let rough edges hold the mic. That includes speech problems, urban cadence, or, the whole emotional sensitivity package. The room on the recording laughed. Victor stopped the CD. No one moved for a moment. What they held now wasn't just a pattern. It was proof. The same voice that stripped Elijah of his dignity in the auditorium had institutionalized the practice of exclusion. The racism wasn't passive. It was structured, celebrated, policy masked as professionalism. Dolores handed over the folder without hesitation. She said she had waited for years for the right story to rise, one undeniable, one too loud to ignore. Elijah had become that story, and now he wasn't standing alone. But even as they left Dolores' house, with new evidence in hand, a heaviness followed them back into the car. Every piece of truth they collected built a stronger case, but it also invited deeper resistance. The system wasn't going to surrender quietly, and Elijah had no idea that somewhere inside the district office, the case files were already being amended, not erased, amended, to create a new paper trail, one that painted Tamara as unstable, and Elijah as aggressive. And deep in a locked drawer, a fresh letter was being drafted. It wasn't about denial this time. It was about removal. The secret tape that could break the school. The discovery of the decade-long suppression system should have been enough to anchor the coming battle, but the truth had a way of widening rather than settling. As Tamara and Marlene continued organizing documents and connecting the dots between past victims, neither suspected that an even more devastating piece of evidence was already moving toward them, unannounced, unseen, and destined to shift the ground beneath Sterling Pines Middle School. It arrived quietly, much like all the turning points in Elijah's story, delivered through an encrypted email sent directly to Victor's private inbox with no subject line, no explanation, only an attachment labeled with a date and the initials of the school's principal. Victor opened it without expectation. What played through his headphones made him freeze in place. The recording wasn't like the ones Elijah secretly captured in hallways or classrooms. This one came from inside the administrative conference room, with voices far clearer and sharper than he anticipated. The timestamp matched a date weeks before Elijah's assembly humiliation, during a period when staff were supposedly discussing new policies for student leadership opportunities. But the words captured revealed a meeting shaped by agendas far more sinister. Principal McLaren's voice dominated the tape, controlled yet burning with a prejudice sharpened by years of unchallenged authority. His tone carried the cold precision of someone outlining strategy, not emotion, and every sentence revealed the truth behind Sterling Pines' polished reputation. He referred to Elijah directly, reducing him to a risk factor, something the school could not afford to showcase. He referenced test scores, demographic metrics, public visibility, and then finally, the line that would become the spark for everything that followed. It arrived with no hesitation, spoken with the certainty of a man who believed he would never be held accountable. It was blunt, final, and hideously revealing. The school could not let a black deaf boy represent them publicly. The recording continued, implicating others in the room who murmured agreement, each adding layers of compliance that made the prejudice feel institutional rather than personal. They discussed narrative control, strategies to redirect Elijah's academic path, and how to frame his limitations in documentation that appeared legitimate. Their planning was methodical, rehearsed, disturbingly confident, as if dismantling opportunities for children like Elijah was simply part of protocol. Victor replayed the tape multiple times, slower each round, feeling the weight of every syllable. This was no longer about bias masked as concern. This was concrete evidence of systemic racism, captured in the administrator's own voices. He knew instantly that the audio was not meant for them. It was a leak, deliberate or accidental, from someone inside the school who had grown tired of watching injustice thrive behind closed doors. When Victor forwarded the tape to Marlene and Tamara, the reaction was wordless at first. There was nothing to explain. The recording said everything. It validated Elijah's struggles, exposed a decade of institutional sabotage, and revealed the true motives behind every barrier he had faced since enrolling. It transformed the fight from a parent versus school dispute into an undeniable civil rights case with national implications. Marlene authenticated the recording with digital specialists who traced its metadata, confirming that it had not been altered and that it had originated within the school's network. She knew immediately the tape would carry enormous legal weight, yet she also understood that timing would be crucial. Once the tape became public, the school would mobilize aggressively, not with introspection or remorse, but with denial and counter-narratives, designed to discredit both Elijah and his family. Victor wrestled with the moral dilemma of releasing the tape. His instinct was to protect Elijah, but he recognized that silence would allow the administrators to continue manipulating the narrative. After hours of analyzing the potential fallout and speaking privately with Marlene, he chose to share the recording with a trusted investigative journalist, a longtime friend who had spent years exposing education inequity. She recognized its significance instantly and began preparing a feature for an upcoming broadcast, double-checking every file, every timestamp, every line of policy referenced on the tape. The story broke within 24 hours. Local news stations ran headlines that shook the community. A middle school principal caught on tape conspiring to suppress a black disabled student. Parents who had once believed Sterling Pines was a safe haven reacted with outrage and the school district scrambled to issue statements claiming the tape was doctored, fabricated by unknown parties intending to damage community trust. But the denial failed almost immediately. Activists analyzed the audio publicly, confirming its authenticity. Former teachers stepped forward to admit they had heard similar language behind closed doors. Past students began sharing stories of being redirected, misclassified, and underestimated, all connecting threads the school could no longer dismiss. Soon, protest formed outside Sterling Pines. Parents who had long accepted the school's polished image realized they had mistaken silence for fairness. They held signs demanding accountability, shouting not with rage, but with urgency born from betrayal. Students began posting anonymous testimonies online, creating a movement that expanded far beyond Elijah's case. Yet amid the noise, the one person who said nothing was Elijah. He watched the coverage from the living room couch, knees drawn to his chest. The world was reacting to words he had not even heard until days before. His name echoed across screens, framed by headlines he never asked for. And though the attention validated everything he suffered, it also overwhelmed him. He had wanted to speak on his own terms, through his own words, not become a symbol of a battle he was still emotionally processing. His quietness worried Tamara, though she understood the storms moving beneath his surface. He had spent years fighting to be heard, only for his voice to be drowned again by the magnitude of a scandal. He feared hoping for justice. Hope had betrayed him before, back when adults clapped for the idea of fairness but refused to practice it. So he stayed still, listening but not reacting, absorbing every detail with the sensitivity of a child learning that the world he inhabited was sharper than he imagined. The school district eventually announced an internal review, but the community dismissed it before it began. The calls for McLaren's resignation grew louder, amplified by parents who once defended him. Yet the principal appeared at press conferences composed, asserting innocence, insisting the recording was a fabrication orchestrated by individuals with personal agendas. His cold confidence rattled Tamara. She recognized arrogance in his tone. An arrogance rooted not in courage but in the belief that institutions protect themselves before they protect children. It was during one such press conference that an unexpected twist emerged. Someone submitted an anonymous document to the news station, a transcript of meetings from 3 years prior, with strikingly similar language, implicating additional staff members, some still employed, some quietly retired. This new evidence suggested that the discriminatory system captured in the tape was not an isolated policy, but an ongoing strategy shaped over multiple administrations. The school had not simply stumbled into inequity, it had documented it, preserved it, and modeled it as part of its culture. The revelation intensified the protests, drawing crowds larger than the school had ever seen. And yet inside the Carter home, Elijah remained tense, withdrawn, bracing himself against the possibility that even with proof, the world might still choose to ignore him. His fear was not of losing the contest. He feared that those in power would rewrite the narrative again, twisting facts, questioning his motives, framing him as fragile or unstable, casting doubt on his lived experience. But nothing prepared them for what happened the night before the largest scheduled protest. Tamara stepped outside to retrieve a delivery when she saw it. Spray paint across the siding of their home, bold, jagged strokes carved with violence rather than haste. The words stretched across the surface like a threat carved into stone. Speak and suffer. For the first time since the fight began, the battle had come to their doorstep. It was no longer administrative, no longer hidden, no longer theoretical. It had turned personal and dangerous. Hate mail, threats, and a mother's breaking point. The paint had barely dried on the side of the house when the next message arrived. Colder, heavier, more deliberate. Tamara had stepped outside early that morning to retrieve the mail, not expecting the weight that dropped into her palm. An unmarked envelope rested on top of the usual stack of bills and coupons. She opened it right there, barefoot on the front porch, and her hands trembled before her mind had time to process the full meaning. Inside was a single typed letter, cut clean, centered, devoid of emotion. No salutation, no signature. Just one line, pressed with cruel clarity: withdraw your complaint or pay the price. Taped to the bottom of the page, with surgical precision, was a bullet. She dropped everything. The sound of the metal hitting the wooden porch cracked through the air like a gunshot itself. For a moment, the street seemed to still. Tamara stood frozen, the wind brushing her cheek like a whisper of warning. Her first instinct was to run inside, but she paused, swallowed the panic rising in her throat, and bent down to collect the envelope with shaking fingers. By the time she stepped back into the house, something inside her had shifted permanently. Within an hour, law enforcement arrived. A report was filed. The envelope and bullet were bagged, labeled, and taken for evidence. Officers asked procedural questions and offered protective measures that felt more performative than protective drive-bys, check-ins, nothing that truly pierced the isolation of being publicly targeted. When asked if she had any idea who might be responsible, Tamara didn't answer, not because she didn't know, but because she couldn't choose just one name. Everyone knew. The tape had exposed it all. The community had heard it. The students had seen it. The district had been humiliated, Yet the principal remained employed, and the speech therapist who had written Elijah off still sat behind her desk. The walls of silence hadn't collapsed. They'd thickened, and now, the silence was turning into threat. The police couldn't or wouldn't connect the dots publicly. Tamara and Elijah were placed under unofficial protective watch, the kind that only came with warnings and cautionary advice, but no real barrier against those determined to scare them into silence. Tamara began double-checking the locks. Every night, the blinds stayed closed. Every noise outside their window after midnight triggered a surge of adrenaline. She slept in short bursts, shoes by the bed, car keys nearby, just in case. But what disturbed her more than the threat was the response, or lack of one, from the people who had once claimed to care. The same community leaders who posted about justice and equity had fallen quiet. Their silence wasn't accidental. It was calculated. The school board avoided press conferences. The PTA canceled meetings out of respect for the investigation. The neighborhood Facebook group disabled comments on posts mentioning Elijah. It was as if the town had collectively decided that pretending neutrality was safer than acknowledging the truth. Tamara carried the weight of that cowardice in every breath. She considered withdrawing Elijah from school entirely. Each morning felt like a new negotiation with danger. Should she send him or not? Would the staff treat him worse under the spotlight? Could she guarantee his safety? The internal debate consumed her, and yet she couldn't forget the look in Elijah's eyes when he saw the spray-painted words on the house. He hadn't flinched, he hadn't spoken, but the quiet fire behind his expression told her everything she needed to know. Elijah had grown in ways the school hadn't anticipated. He had been hurt, silenced, manipulated, and mocked. But somewhere inside the humiliation, he had forged something harder than anger: resolve. And it was that resolve that finally overpowered the fear in Tamara's chest. Still, the toll was undeniable. Tamara found herself walking through the days in a fog. Each knock on the door twisted her stomach. Each phone call from an unknown number made her hands sweat. She checked Elijah's backpack compulsively for messages, notes, any warning signs that something new was brewing. The weight of protecting him physically, emotionally, legally, pressed against her with every hour. And then just when the weight seemed impossible to bear, something shifted again. Tamara had spent the entire evening organizing files for Marlene's legal filing. Case numbers, student testimonies, years of silenced complaints. She barely noticed Elijah slip past her and into his room. It wasn't until she went to check on him that she saw the glow from his computer screen still lighting up his face. Even after midnight, he didn't notice her in the doorway. His eyes were locked on the screen, fingers moving quickly, decisively. And there it was, on the monitor. The National Youth Speech Finals website, an application portal, a submission form. She stepped closer and saw that he had already filled out every field. Name, age, independent representation, speech title. Silence was never a choice. The submit button blinked in the corner, and with one final breath he pressed it. Tamara didn't speak. She just stood there as Elijah looked up, startled but unashamed. In his expression was not the boy who once trembled on stage, not the student who had been labeled and discarded, but a young man who had realized that courage was not the absence of fear but action in spite of it. He hadn't asked permission. He didn't need to. She returned to her desk without a word, and let the silence between them hold what words couldn't. Later that night, after Elijah had fallen asleep, Tamara sat alone at the kitchen table. The envelope from earlier that morning, the bullet and the threat rested in a plastic evidence bag beside her. On the other side sat a printed confirmation of Elijah's successful registration in the speech finals. It felt symbolic. One note meant to silence him. The other meant to let him speak louder than ever. And yet, a quiet dread lingered. If someone had sent a bullet to their mailbox, what else might come next? What neither of them knew was that someone else had already begun watching their steps far more closely than the police ever would. 3 blocks away, from inside a car that hadn't moved in nearly 2 hours, a figure sat with a tablet connected to an encrypted school network. The screen displayed Elijah's application. The district's internal flagging system had already been triggered, and just below the submission confirmation, a single line blinked in red: initiate disciplinary proceedings, unauthorized representation. The machine was still working. The battle wasn't over. It was only getting closer to home. The surprise acceptance, and the backlash that followed. 2 days after Elijah submitted his last-minute application to the National Youth Speech Finals, the email arrived with no fanfare. No call, no build-up, just a bolded subject line that froze Tamara's hand as she scrolled. Finalist confirmation, independent division, Elijah Carter. For a second she couldn't breathe. She clicked the message open with trembling fingers, scanning the words twice before her brain could process them. Elijah had been accepted. Against everything the district tried to sabotage, despite the erasure, despite the smear campaign, he had been chosen to compete. Officially, nationally, without their permission. Tamara called out his name, but Elijah was already standing behind her, somehow sensing it before the words left her mouth. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just stared at the screen, as if reading the words himself would make them more real. In his eyes was something raw, not just victory, but the ache of surviving everything it took to get there. But celebration came and went in a heartbeat. By nightfall, the news had leaked. It began on a message board buried deep in a local community forum. A thread titled, "D's Grace, District Reject, Still Chosen for National Speech Contest." Within hours, the story spread across social media like oil on water. The same people who had stayed silent when Elijah was being humiliated were now vocal and cruel. They shared screenshots of the tape, the protest signs, the bullet threats, twisting every detail into something it was never meant to be. They called him a charity pick, a diversity case, a deaf boy who couldn't even pronounce his own name. Hashtags emerged mocking him, mocking his mother, mocking the idea that someone like him could represent anything but shame. Speak right or sit down. Not my finalist. Some even suggested he had faked his disability for sympathy. Others argued that his acceptance degraded the standard of the entire contest. But the cruelty didn't stop there. A petition launched less than 24 hours later, demanding the contest disqualify Elijah. It gathered thousands of signatures almost instantly, driven by anonymous accounts and faceless organizations that had never cared about youth speech before. The comments accompanying the signatures weren't subtle. They were steeped in racist code, ableist slurs, and veiled threats. It wasn't about rules or fairness. It was about who they believed deserved to speak, and who didn't. Tamara watched it all unfold, with a protective fury that never left her chest. But Elijah? He didn't flinch. His shoulders were square now. He stood straighter, breathed slower, watched more. Something inside him had calcified in the face of hate. He wasn't unaffected. He had simply learned how to survive under scrutiny. Victor stepped in without waiting for permission. He doubled Elijah's coaching hours. Every afternoon, every evening, even weekends. But it wasn't just speech drills anymore. Victor taught him how to carry a storm inside his chest, and still walk like the sky was clear. He taught him to slow his breathing when reading hate, to grip the mic like a sword, not a prop. He taught him how to control not just his voice, but the narrative that would surround it. And Elijah absorbed it all. He rewrote parts of his speech again, not because he doubted himself, but because the noise had changed. The stakes were no longer just about performance. They were about defiance. His speech wasn't simply a story. It was a rebuttal, a refusal, a challenge to every person who had ever decided for him who he was allowed to be. Tamara didn't speak much during those days. She simply watched. Her son, who once hid behind closed doors after being mocked, now stood in the middle of the living room, practicing lines with the same breathless power she remembered from his younger days, before the school crushed it out of him. The contest was in Chicago, a 3-hour flight from Tennessee. Victor made arrangements, booking the tickets under his name, shielding them from potential district interference. He ensured Elijah would arrive rested, protected, and prepared. But 2 days before the flight, Tamara noticed something strange. A letter from the school arrived, addressed directly to her son. Inside, it contained a reminder that any participation in off-campus events without district approval violated the school's code of conduct. No direct threats, just bureaucracy dressed like concern. It included bolded language about misrepresenting the school district and creating unnecessary liability. It was an indirect warning, but the meaning was unmistakable. If Elijah went through with this, they would try to punish him. Tamara forwarded the letter to Marlene, who responded swiftly and documented it as evidence of intimidation. She assured them the law was on Elijah's side now. The school had no control here, but Tamara still felt a cold coil of dread tightening in her chest. On the night before their departure, Elijah packed his own bag. He laid his speech printout carefully between his clothing, wrapped in a plastic folder, double-checked by Victor for typos, tone, and flow. There was something ceremonial about it, like preparing armor before a war. He placed his jacket on top, the same one he had sewn the microphone into months ago, now symbolic of everything he had recorded, everything he had endured. Victor texted their itinerary. The flight was scheduled for 6:10 a.m., non-stop to O'Hare. Elijah was scheduled to speak at 3:30 p.m. the next day. Timing would be tight, but it was manageable. That night, Tamara didn't sleep. She checked their bags 3 times, confirmed the reservation, set 4 alarms. The house was silent, heavy with anticipation. The light above the kitchen sink remained on as a small gesture against the darkness pressing at their door. At 4:45 a.m., they arrived at the airport, tired but steady. Security was unusually crowded. The line was slow. When they reached the gate, the departure screen blinked red. Cancel. Tamara stared in disbelief. She checked her phone. No alerts. No emails. No weather delay. Victor rushed to the counter. The airline representative spoke in clipped sentences, their tone nervous. A technical error had grounded the flight. They could not rebook until the following day. Victor demanded escalation. Tamara called Marlene. Elijah stood to the side, gripping the handle of his suitcase tightly, watching as his chance began to slip away again. This time not from words but from logistics that didn't add up. That was when Victor's assistant called with an update. Their reservation had been flagged in the system and rerouted for suspicious behavior. It wasn't random. Someone had interfered. Not the school, not the district, but someone with access to flight registries. Tamara's stomach dropped. Elijah's name wasn't just on a school watch list anymore. Someone else was watching, far beyond the school walls. And they weren't just trying to silence him. They were trying to stop him from ever arriving. Grounded. When TSA used his disability against him. Thank you for confirming your format and continuing with this powerful story. The cancelled flight had felt like a calculated blow, but nothing prepared Tamara or Elijah for what awaited them. When they attempted to rebook, the airline representative insisted that no earlier flights were available, yet the grim expression flickering across her face hinted at something deeper. Something she wasn't authorized to say. Victor's assistant confirmed their reservation had been flagged, but how that could happen remained unclear. TSA interference wasn't standard, and yet every sign pointed to someone intentionally restricting Elijah's movement. The stakes had already risen beyond school politics. Now it involved federal security systems, layers of surveillance, and a sudden suspicion that someone was tracking Elijah outside the school's reach. Determined not to lose time, Tamara and Elijah moved to the security line again, hoping to switch terminals for a different flight. They carried nothing but backpacks, and the folder containing Elijah's speech. But as they approached the conveyor belt, the atmosphere shifted. TSA officers whispered among themselves, glancing repeatedly toward Elijah. Their eyes traveled not to his hands or bag, but to the small hearing device, nestled behind his ear, an assistive tool he had worn for years without incident. Yet here in this airport, under this scrutiny, it transformed into something threatening in the eyes of those who did not understand it. The officer's posture stiffened as he directed Elijah to step aside. It happened so quickly, Tamara barely had time to react. One moment Elijah stood beside her. The next he was being escorted toward a secondary inspection room. The officer's explanation was vague, citing suspicious body language and an unidentified electronic device. Tamara tried to follow, but another officer blocked her path, requesting that she wait outside until the inspection concluded. Her breath caught at the sight of the door closing between her and her son. All at once, every threat, every message, every attempt to silence him surged back into her chest with sharp, suffocating force. Inside the inspection room, Elijah sat alone. The fluorescent lights cast an unforgiving glare against the cold steel of the table. He placed his hands on his lap, fingers interlocked, shoulders drawn inward. He had been here before in different ways, in classrooms where scrutiny felt weaponized, in auditoriums where judgment echoed louder than applause, in offices where administrators wrote assessments that defined him before he could define himself. But this felt different. This room wasn't built for evaluation. It was built for containment, and he knew immediately that his disability had been reframed as danger. The officers circled him slowly. They examined his hearing device as though it were a foreign object, rather than medical equipment. They took photos, ran tests, whispered among themselves. Hours passed. No food, no water, no contact with his mother. The walls felt smaller each minute, pressing him into silence, so intense it pulsed. They asked for technical details he could not provide, questioned his movements at the airport, and treated each hesitation in his speech as evidence of deceit. Elijah tried to steady his breathing, remembering Victor's training: slow inhale, Controlled exhale, center the mind, but the fear crawled deeper the longer he was kept isolated. Outside, Tamara paced with furious helplessness. Her voice had been dismissed repeatedly by TSA officers, who insisted her son was undergoing a routine secondary examination. She knew routine. This was not routine. The longer they held him, the more her mind raced through the events leading up to this point. The forged evaluations, the vandalism, the flagged flight reservation. Someone had been working relentlessly behind the scenes to block Elijah's path. She feared this was simply the next escalation. Desperate, she called Victor. He immediately understood the gravity of the situation and contacted the civil rights organization that had intervened before. Within minutes, attorneys began making calls to TSA supervisors, airport administrators, and federal compliance offices. The pressure rose layer by layer until the officers inside the interrogation room received orders to step back. Suddenly, the questions stopped. The tension dissolved, not naturally, but abruptly, as though someone had forcibly severed the thread holding Elijah in place. The door opened at last. Elijah stepped out, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable, his hearing device returned but handled enough to feel foreign on his skin. When Tamara saw him, relief washed over her so fiercely her knees trembled. She reached for him instinctively, but he walked into her arms slowly, as though still grounding himself in reality after being treated like a threat. They left the security area in silence. But the silence felt heavier than anything they had endured before. It wasn't the silence of exhaustion. It was the silence that follows violation, the kind that breaks something fragile and forces new resilience to form in its place. Victor's assistant had managed to secure a last-minute red-eye flight. It was the only option left, the only chance to reach Chicago before Elijah's scheduled time. Though the margin was razor-thin, Tamara clutched the boarding passes like proof of survival. As they approached the gate, the surrounding passengers moved with routine energy, unaware that the boy standing among them had just endured a violation far deeper than a missed flight. When the plane finally boarded, Elijah sat by the window, staring out at the empty tarmac. His reflection stared back at him, a boy caught between fear and fire. He thought of the officers watching him, judging him not for who he was, but for what they perceived. He thought of every moment in school, when adults treated him as incapable. He thought of the bullet in the mailbox, the message on his house, the forged evaluations, the petition demanding he be disqualified. And yet something inside him hardened, not into bitterness, but into resolve. He understood now that the fight was never about the speech alone. It was about proving he had the right to speak at all. The plane took off into a midnight sky streaked with distant storms. Elijah closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to gather every shard of strength he had left. Tamara watched him quietly, knowing the journey had already taken more from him than any child should be asked to bear. But she also recognized the shift in him. The boy who once feared being heard was becoming someone who refused to be silent. As the hours passed and the plane drifted forward, the world below remained unaware of the struggle unfolding at 30,000 feet. But the contest clock did not pause. Every minute mattered. Every delay threatened everything Elijah had worked for. The flight landed just as dawn brushed the edge of the horizon. The moment the wheels hit the runway, Tamara's phone buzzed with a notification from the event coordinator. The contest had begun. They were late, and the opening speeches were already underway. Elijah opened his eyes just as the announcement echoed through the cabin that passengers could disembark. He understood instantly what that meant. Time had run ahead of him, indifferent to the journey he had survived to reach this point. The world would not wait for him. He stood up anyway. He stepped into the aisle, and he prepared to run into a contest already unfolding, without him. Because even if the world didn't wait for his voice, he was ready to make them hear it. The speech that shook the stadium. The wheels of the plane hadn't even stopped spinning before Elijah was up from his seat, heart pounding beneath his sweat-soaked hoodie, backpack clutched in one hand, speech folder in the other. He hadn't slept on the red-eye flight. Neither had Tamara. They sat in silence most of the ride, holding their fears in separate corners of the sky, too exhausted to speak, too focused to break. Victor had stayed back to arrange legal responses to the TSA incident, and the civil rights organization's intervention had barely gotten them on the flight in time. Every second had been stolen back from a system that was still trying to delay them. But the delay had cost them. As they stepped into the bright terminal lights of O'Hare, Tamara's phone buzzed with a missed call. Then another. Then a message. Contest has begun. Elijah not on check-in list. Judges moving forward. She showed it to him without speaking. His face didn't change. He simply started walking faster. By the time they reached the stadium, the parking lot was full. Inside, the event was already halfway through its speaker lineup. Parents in suits and children in polished blazers lined the hallway, their voices muffled under the announcements echoing from the auditorium doors. Elijah moved like a shadow past them, every step pushing against the rising panic swelling in his chest. His name wasn't called. His slot had been skipped. He was, in their eyes, disqualified. But he hadn't come this far to be erased again. As Tamara argued at the side registration desk, trying to explain the flight cancellation, the TSA delay, the intervention paperwork, Elijah stepped away. He moved quietly through the corridor, pressing his palm against the cool metal of the door leading to the main auditorium. The moment he opened it, the hum of 1,000 hushed conversations hit him. Spotlights painted the stage in gold. A student had just finished presenting. Applause scattered like rain. Then a pause. One of the contest officials leaned toward the mic, announcing the next name on the list. Someone 2 slots ahead. Elijah recognized the error instantly. They had moved on, and they had left him behind. But when he stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, the crowd noticed. A boy in worn jeans, a wrinkled hoodie, and a face that had lived 100 moments of silence, walked toward the stage. There was no escort, no introduction, no music, just the steady sound of his footsteps as he climbed the stairs, one breath at a time. The microphone loomed in the center like a question waiting to be answered. In the front row, one of the judges stood abruptly, speaking into her headset, pointing toward the side of the stage. She motioned for security. Contest protocol had been broken. The rules said no late entries, no unregistered speakers. But something strange happened. The audience didn't move. No one clapped. No one booed. They just watched. And as Elijah took his place in front of the mic, placing his speech folder on the stand, someone near the back began to rise. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the tension cracked. A ripple of applause began, cautious at first, then growing louder, stronger, louder still. Not because they knew him, but because somehow, they understood. This wasn't defiance. This was reclamation. The judge who had objected sat down slowly, her headset still on, but her voice silent now. No one escorted him off the stage. The air shifted. The space allowed him to exist. He looked out into the crowd, scanning faces that blurred together under the heat of the lights. Then he took a breath. Not to calm himself, but to remember. The microphone hissed slightly as he leaned forward.
And then he spoke.
His voice cracked, not from fear, but from weight. The kind of weight that comes from carrying too many silences on one small back. He didn't start with an introduction. He started with truth. The title of his speech, The Power of Being Heard, was written in bold, at the top of his page. But he didn't read it. He lived it. He spoke of being called broken by adults, who were supposed to protect him, of being shoved into silence under the pretense of support. He described the moment a principal told an auditorium that deaf boys didn't belong on stage. The moment his voice trembled and the world laughed. The moment they deleted his speech, his records, and tried to erase his name. But then his tone shifted. He spoke not of revenge, but of rising, of what it meant to speak after being told you shouldn't, of what it cost to stand up again, knowing you might be pushed down. He didn't deliver a perfect speech. His stutter surfaced. His rhythm stuttered. But none of it mattered. Each imperfection was a wound turned into witness. Each pause held more power than perfect prose ever could. The room stayed utterly still. Phone stopped recording. Eyes stopped blinking. He ended with a sentence that didn't come from the page, but from the years he spent trying to be understood. And then he stepped back. For a moment, there was silence. Heavy, sacred, like the room didn't know how to breathe after what it had just heard. Then came the applause. It wasn't loud at first, but it grew. From the back rows to the front, from strangers to organizers, from teens to elders, it surged. It wasn't celebration. It was acknowledgement. A recognition that this wasn't just a speech. It was a reckoning. Tamara watched from the wings, frozen. Her hands clasped over her mouth, tears rolling without resistance. She hadn't seen her son become this. Only now could she witness it. A boy transformed not by opportunity, but by opposition. Backstage, a volunteer tried to get Elijah's attention, motioning for him to exit so the next speaker could prepare. But before he could move, a hush fell over the room again. Someone was walking toward the stage. Not a contestant. Not a judge. It was Principal McLaren. He wore a pressed blazer and the same confident posture he always had in faculty meetings and press conferences. His presence alone pulled tension into the room. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The judge who had objected earlier turned toward the back, confused. No one had invited him. No one had expected him. He moved slowly, deliberately, eyes fixed on Elijah. Tamara stepped forward, but someone held her back gently. Elijah didn't move. McLaren ascended the stairs without speaking. His shoes echoed across the polished wood of the stage. He stopped just behind Elijah, close enough for the audience to feel the weight of their history pressed into that single frame. And then, with the microphone still live, he reached into his jacket pocket. Elijah tensed. Tamara froze. Security moved toward the stage. But what McLaren pulled out wasn't a document. It was a folded piece of notebook paper, creased, thin, yellowed at the corners. He unfolded it slowly, held it out toward Elijah. The boy didn't take it. The room held its breath. On the paper, written in faint ink, were the words of Elijah's very first speech. The one he had tried to deliver the day McLaren pulled the mic from his hands. The one they said didn't matter. Somehow he had kept it, and now he was returning it. But the look in McLaren's eyes wasn't remorse. It was calculation. Because inside that folded page was something else. Taped to the back of it, barely visible, was a printed memo. The same kind of memo used in Elijah's forged psychological record. Identical font, identical format. Only this one had no name at the top. Just a typed label. Contest eligibility status, for internal review only. And at the bottom, signed with the same 3 initials, KM. Elijah stared at it, realizing this wasn't a peace offering. It was leverage, and the contest wasn't over. When the principal showed up, and what she said, the stage lights glowed harsh and unyielding, as the crowd's applause began to swell, still echoing in the auditorium's high ceiling. For a moment the energy felt like release, out of pain, out of silence, finally into voice. Elijah stood with a simple steadiness, eyes forward, chest steady, as if the weight of all that had come before now gave him balance, instead of breaking him. Around him audience members shifted, leaning forward, strangers, judges, parents, students, all drawn by something that felt bigger than a contest. It was the recognition of truth, raw and exposed under the spotlight. Then, from the heavy doors behind the stage, a slow movement. The hush arrived first, subtle, tremulous, like a breath held too long. The auditorium fell still. All attention turned. It was not part of the program. It was not announced. Yet there she stood, Principal McLaren. Her figure carried the calm posture of authority, the polished clothes of administration, the same blazer she wore on parent-teacher nights and official meetings. The recognition of her presence hit like a thunderclap. No one spoke. The contest froze in that heartbeat of silence. Organizers, spectators, even the air between them seemed to stop moving. A murmur rose, a ripple of confusion. Was she allowed here? Did she have permission? The judges exchanged glances behind clipped lips. Contest rules had been broken when Elijah walked on stage, but this was something else. A hijack. A spectacle. McLaren walked slowly toward the microphone stand. The stage seemed wide enough to swallow her, yet she filled it with certainty. She didn't reach toward the speech folder in Elijah's hand, or the podium. At least not yet. Instead she stood just behind him, watching as if rehearsing every word she meant to deliver. The hush deepened, the crowd aware that what came next would not be applause or evaluation, but accusation. The head judge moved forward, lips parted to speak, but McLaren ducked her chin, raised a hand to cut off whatever protest might begin. The tension surged like electricity. In that moment, the auditorium felt smaller, the weight of all institutional power concentrated in one figure. McLaren's presence wasn't just confrontation, it was control aggressively reasserted over every cracked voice, every hidden loophole, every past injustice exposed. She drew a breath. The silence leaned in. Then she spoke. Her words weren't thunderous. They weren't meant to be persuasive. They were meant to dominate the space, to remind everyone exactly who held authority and who was supposed to obey. She accused, not with polite distance but with sharp finality, calling Elijah a liar, a disruption, someone whose acceptance into the contest was a mockery to standards, to the institution, to every rule ever written to keep order. She demanded his immediate disqualification. She asked the judges to remove his eligibility as a representative under any capacity. The accusation hung in the air like a stain. For a moment, nothing moved. The microphone gauged the low hum of tension. Then, from somewhere in the back, a parent gasped. Other voices trembled. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The contest began unraveling. A murmur turned into protest. People realized that this was more than competition. This was a public reckoning. The head judge rose slowly from her seat. In her hand, a slim folder. Official, clean. She lifted it. Her face was unreadable. The room held its breath again. On either side of her, other judges leaned forward, hands clasped, glances darting between McLaren and Elijah. Outside the spotlight, backstage organizers whispered, consulted quietly. The sudden appearance of the principal, the protest outside, the leaked tape, the bomb threats, the social media uproar. None of it could be dismissed with a polite apology. The judge opened the folder. Inside were documents, transcripts, time-stamped audio logs, affidavits from former students, the torn note found in Elijah's backpack, the CD from the retired teacher, the leaked internal memo. All the evidence was there. All linked, all undeniable. The tape McLaren had sought to bury had resurfaced. The system she had cloaked in policy was unraveling under its own record. As the judge cleared her throat, the silence extended, heavy as truth. Some in the crowd gasped again. Others exhaled. McLaren's posture shifted imperceptibly. The confidence faltered ever so slightly. The power she wielded felt smaller under the weight of those documents, those voices. The contest wasn't athletic. It wasn't a fight, but it was a fight for visibility, for dignity, for truth. Then came a twist no one saw coming. From the back row, a voice, low, firm, calm. Not for the first time but for effect. It echoed across the room, carried by surprise. A former teacher, one whose name had appeared in the affidavit folder, rose slowly and walked down the aisle. The auditorium clicked, recognition spreading like wildfire. No one expected a teacher to come forward now. But there she was, the woman who had retained years of documentary evidence, who had recorded staff meetings, who had risked anonymity to protect truth. She stepped onto the stage, beside the judge, holding another folder, older, heavier, thicker, pages spilled over with names, dates, incidents, more than just policy violations, whispers of pattern, of suppressed voices, of children erased. The crowd exhaled as one. The evidence multiplied. Suddenly, the moral weight of Elijah's struggle expanded beyond one boy, one contest, one district. It became a moment demanding justice. A moment demanding visibility. McLaren shifted again. Her face hardened, eyes narrowing. She opened her mouth, but no words came. The power of paperwork, of collected testimony, had already done what her accusations tried to undo. The microphone trembled slightly from static. The hum of the speakers loud under the sudden shift in energy. For the first time, the auditorium felt safe. Not because danger had vanished, but because truth had found a home in plain sight. The head judge slid the folder closed, turned slowly, and raised a hand. The room quieted instantly. The gavel didn't strike. There was no official bell, no formal closure. But the silence meant decision. They whispered among themselves, nodded, compared papers, consulted, then turned back. The lead judge stood straight, looked directly at Elijah, and opened the folder once more. The weight of the moment pressed through every breath. In her hand she held a slip of paper. On it typed clearly, eligibility restored, contest resumption authorized. A wave of tension lifted. A release that cracked free under decades of suppression, of lies, of erasure. The auditorium exhaled. Some eyes glistened. Others turned thoughtful, ashamed, awakened. It was more than victory. It was acknowledgement. But as the room erupted, phones lifted, cameras flashed, a roar of tentative hope. Elijah didn't move. He didn't reach for the mic again yet. Instead, he looked at McLaren, at the woman whose voice tried to silence him, whose policies tried to bury him, whose catalog of institutional power tried to erase him. She stood frozen beside the other adults. Around her, chaos bloomed. Parents shouting not in anger, but in affirmation. Students crying. Organizers scrambling for protocol. Then the unexpected twist fully emerged. McLaren held something in her hand. Not a document. Not a denial. Not the contest folder. But a small device. A phone. She raised it, recording. As the crowd surged, as judges attempted to restore order, she began speaking again. Not into the microphone. Into her phone. Her words reached no one in the auditorium, but they reached those whose power did not rely on applause or authority. She threatened silent retaliation. Quiet, coded words about messy reputations, media stains, damaged funding, uncooperative parents, future opportunities. She promised consequences, not visible under lights, but real behind doors. She promised that the school district would survive, that some voices, loud today, might be silenced tomorrow. She ended the recording, clipped the phone shut, pocketed it, and turned away, stepping behind the judge's panel. The roar of support couldn't drown that final act. The applause paused. The camera flashes faltered. The victory felt unstable, like a photograph taken in a lightning storm. Beautiful in the moment, but unpredictable once the thunder fades. Elijah sensed it. Tamara sensed it. Victor sensed it. The danger had grown beyond policy violations, beyond legal documents, beyond public hearings. This was now also a war of shadows, one fought not with evidence only, but with quiet threats, hidden recordings, and power that didn't step under spotlights. But none of them stepped back. Not now, not ever, because the truth was out. The proof existed. The world had heard, and as the lead judge prepared to announce the final ruling, raising her hand once more, the room held its breath. From unfit to speak to a national hero, the auditorium held its breath, as the lead judge slowly placed the decision slip back into the folder. Her face composed but heavy with a weight far larger than the contest's stakes. For a moment, the only sound was the polished hush between rows of seats, the shifting weight of humanity waiting. Then she raised her hand, a subtle signal, but enough. The hush broke. The air exhaled with anticipation. Cameras flashed, phones lifted. In that instant, the announcement cut through decades of suppression like a bolt through sky. The winner of the National Youth Speech Finals is Elijah Carter. Shock ricocheted through the room, followed by a surge of sound. Applause at first hesitant, then rising, swelling, mountains of recognition crashing against the walls. Some faces in the crowd cried. Others stood in stunned silence, processing the victory not just as a win, but as a verdict. For Elijah, the stage, once a place that had judged him, ridiculed him, cut him down, became the place that lifted him up. He stepped forward, folder trembling slightly in his hands, eyes scanning the room filled with strangers and supporters. The light hit him full. For the first time, he stood not as a student compromised by prejudice, but as a champion defined by truth. Outside, the echoes of that moment radiated fast. Reporters, alerted by the leak from the judge's panel, flooded the venue. Microphones, cameras, pens scratched down the story. A black deaf boy, rejected, oppressed, threatened, had won. Not on sympathy, not on charity, on merit, on voice. The media surge was immediate. Articles appeared by dawn. Headlines ran. From silence to spotlight, teen defies discrimination. When a speech became justice. Elijah Carter, the voice that couldn't be quiet. National networks picked up the story. Within hours, his name trended across social platforms. Hashtags once used to degrade him, flipped into declarations. Heard at last. Elijah Carter speaks. Silence broken. For Tamara, watching the coverage from the side corridor as security ushered them through, the relief came not all at once but slowly, creeping through her chest like warm sunlight after a long winter. Each new camera flashed another layer of redemption over their story. Each question asked by a reporter respectfully, carefully, added validation. She remembered the threats, the bullet taped to the letter, the hostile messages, the fear that had stalked them. Now those threats felt smaller in scale, but not forgotten, because this win wasn't just personal. It had grown into something collective. Within hours of the announcement, messages poured in. Civil rights organizations reached out with offers to amplify Elijah's victory, to use his story as a platform for broader reform. Schools across the country, public, private, charter, wrote statements expressing solidarity. Speech and debate programs offered scholarships and mentorships. Sponsors, even unlikely ones, reached out. A national accessibility advocacy group proposed a fund to support students with disabilities in public speaking competition. Another group offered to provide free hearing aid upgrades to underprivileged children who had been told their voices were unfit. The name Elijah Carter shifted from a local scandal to a national banner for justice, inclusion, and hope. Back at Sterling Pines District Headquarters, the phone lines rang endlessly. Board members held emergency meetings behind closed doors. Emails circulated with defensive language. Some attempted to spin the scandal as an administrative misalignment, others as overzealous compliance gone wrong. But the pressure no longer came only from concerned parents. It came from media scrutiny, from civil rights organizations, from sponsors who threatened to withdraw any support tied to the district. The landscape that once favored silence was shifting under public demand. In the Carter home, the newspaper clippings, printed articles, and congratulatory emails piled up on the kitchen table. Elijah sat cross-legged on the floor, reading each one slowly, touching the headlines gently, as though confirming their existence one by one. Tamara watched him, emotions tangled, pride, relief, disbelief, sadness for all that had been lost before this moment. But mostly hope. A fragile hope growing steadier each time another message arrived. She realized that in fighting for one contest, they had ignited something far larger, a conversation about inclusion, equity, what it means to listen, and who deserves the mic. The days that followed were dizzying. Elijah's school district publicly announced they would launch a formal policy review for special education placement and contest representation guidelines. Administrators who once sheltered behind evaluations and paperwork suddenly found themselves under investigation. Internal memos were subpoenaed. Teachers asked to reevaluate past IEP decisions. District lawyers scrambled to respond to calls from civil rights watchdogs, local media, and even state-level regulators. What had been a hidden system of exclusion was now under nationwide scrutiny. But just as the tide seemed to be turning definitively, the unexpected happened, a twist that no one saw coming. Late one evening, amidst the flurry of congratulations and interviews, a package arrived at the Carter doorstep. It was sealed, formal, stamped with the district seal. Tamara recognized the thin padded envelope immediately. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, no signature. The headline read, "Notice of Counter Lawsuit, Defamation and Disruption of District Operations." The body accused Elijah and his supporters of orchestrating a media attack against the district, alleging damage to reputation, incitement of unrest, and unauthorized distribution of internal documents. The bottom line demanded retraction of public statements, apology, and implied financial restitution. Tamara's breath caught. Elijah looked at her, confusion and dread shadowing his young face. The victory, they realized, wasn't final. It had been celebrated, broadcast, admired, but in the eyes of those who wielded power quietly, it was not forgiven. It was a threat. For the first time since the fight began, the public momentum felt fragile. The district's countersuit threatened not just to devalue their win, but to erase the narrative they had fought so hard to reclaim. Sponsors hesitated. Some activists started asking if rushing forward with public pressure had provoked a backlash. Media outlets that once cheered began publishing cautious op-eds about due process, about impartiality, about both sides of a story. The framing was subtle, but sharp. Shift from hero to disputant, from victim to instigator. Elijah sensed it, even if he couldn't name it. The voices of support were still there, but underneath, a low undercurrent of fear and hesitation had begun. The kind that whispers, what if the danger comes back? What if victory is only temporary? What if the system fights harder when it feels its foundations shaken? In that moment, standing in the living room, rounds of congratulatory bouquets, emails, and pending meetings, Elijah realized something fundamental. The win was more than a trophy. It was a checkpoint, a single breath in a longer journey. Because the fight had never been solely about proving he could speak. It was about proving he belonged, and belonging could not be taken for granted. Not when so many powerful forces saw silence as safety. Tamara placed a hand on his shoulder, gently. There was comfort there, but not relief. She understood what he felt without words. The victory was real, but the war was far from over. The light had shifted, but the shadows still lingered. She looked around their modest home, at awards being printed, contacts being saved, strategies being drafted. She nodded in quiet acceptance that their next move would matter even more than the last. When the sun set that evening, the Carter household remained awake. Not from joy, but from resolve. Outside, the city lights glowed. Inside, the weight of expectation pressed into their bones. The television glowed with evening news updates, citing the district's countersuit. Phones buzzed with messages of support and caution. Emails from civil rights groups detailed the next steps: legal strategy, public filings, awareness campaigns. The world had watched, but now the world needed to hold its gaze. And Elijah, once silenced, then heard, then celebrated, sat at his desk late into the night, his speech folder open, pen in hand. He began writing again. Not a contest speech this time, a letter, to unknown judges, unknown future adversaries, unknown systems, a letter about what it meant to survive, what it meant to remain visible, what it meant to keep speaking, even when the applause echoed against threats. Somewhere deep in him, he felt the spark of defiance reignite. Not for fame, not for recognition, for truth, for those who still waited, unheard. Because this win, this moment of spotlight, was a chance, not to rest, but to build, not to close a chapter, but to open a movement. The legal documents lay untouched on the kitchen table, next to the acceptance letter, the media clippings, the congratulatory messages, victory and vulnerability side by side. The fight had changed shape, from proving eligibility to defending legitimacy, from seeking visibility to protecting truth, and it had grown larger than any stage, any contest, any single voice. As midnight deepened outside, the world grew quiet. But inside the Carter home, a new flame burned, steady, determined, unafraid, and in the silence the pen moved across paper, folding words into hope and resistance. They were not done yet. The lawsuit that shook the district, the filing went in on a crisp Monday morning. Heavy paper folder, thick with affidavits, red-lined copies of internal memos, medical records, audio transcripts, and sworn statements from 17 former students across multiple years. The legal documents, submitted to the county civil court, bore a title stark yet undeniable: Carter et al. v. Sterling Pines School District, Systemic Educational Discrimination. The et al. Represented not just names, but erased voices, students who had been sidelined, silenced, and shuffled into shadows, long before Elijah's story surfaced. For Tamara and Elijah, that folder felt like a seed planted at the root of a prison built of silence. Once the seed took root, nothing would remain hidden. Early news of the lawsuit leaked. Headlines erupted. 17 voices demand justice. School district faces lawsuit over discrimination. Black and disabled youth were denied voice. The local community, which once turned away from protests and tape leaks, now felt the pressure mounting. Teachers who had stayed silent began whispering regrets in corridors. Parents who had once believed in the school's fairness now questioned every transfer, every IEP, every leadership selection. The inbox at the district's legal office overflowed. Phone lines jammed. Trustees canceled vacations. Meeting rooms filled with advisors and PR consultants, scrambling to mitigate damage. The system, once built to protect them, was cracking under exposure. Inside their living room, Tamara sorted through documents handed to them one by one: public records requests, budget sheets, lists of extracurricular participants over the past decade. As she aligned them on the table, the financial patterns came into focus. Budgets allocated for special needs behavioral support surged when minority enrollment increased. Funding for speech therapy programs shrank. Clubs and public speaking teams shrank or disappeared entirely, often citing lack of resources. It wasn't negligence, it was design. A hollowing out of every path that could lead a student like Elijah into public visibility. The suppression wasn't just procedural, it was structural. The deposition hearings began 2 weeks later, in a packed conference room downtown. Former students, parents, even one retired teacher stepped forward under oath. Each account mirrored the next: rejections without cause, evaluations fabricated or misinterpreted, reprimands for speech patterns, immediate redirections to manual or athletic tracks, removal of leadership opportunities. Many broken voices, now seeking justice. Cameras were barred, but the atmosphere crackled with exposure. Lawyers for the district offered defenses steeped in bureaucracy, funding cuts, shifting demographic needs, educational optimization. But against the mounting stack of documents and consistent testimony, the defenses felt hollow, defensive, fragile. In one deposition, a former debate club member, a young black girl from 2018, described with trembling clarity how she had been removed from the team days before the state competition, because her voice might not reflect well on the district. She spoke of watching white classmates with softer accents and neutral tones take her place. Another testified that after a parent complaint, she was quietly transferred to a vocational readiness class, never explained what she did wrong. Several others shared how their parents had signed paperwork they didn't fully understand, pressured by administrators framing the transfer as supportive accommodations. Over and over, pattern emerged, a pattern of steering visible students away from any platform where they might shine. As word spread, the community reaction grew. Protests built outside the district headquarters. Banners read, "Voice denied. Justice demanded. Parents from different neighborhoods came, black and white, disabled and able-bodied, older and younger, united not by shared identity but by shared outrage. Local churches opened their halls for town meetings. Letters poured into local newspapers. Teachers anonymously provided additional documents. One parent delivered a 2015 schedule, showing every public speaking slot had been filled exclusively by white students, even when minority students ahead in seniority existed. The pressure was no longer internal. It had become moral, structural, national. Legal motions piled up. The district tried to delay, postpone, negotiate quietly, offer small settlements to families willing to go away. But with 17 plaintiffs and a growing public record, the strategy backfired. Every delay fueled anger. Every denial spurred more testimony. Every internal memo released added weight against the district. What had begun as a case for one boy became a reckoning for decades of systemic silencing. Then came the board meeting. One broadcast live, one that would redefine the district's future. The trustees assembled in a room crowded with press, protesters, parents, civil rights advocates. On the dais sat the principal, the speech therapist, other administrators implicated in the records. The tension felt like static before a storm. As one by one the trustees stood to vote on whether to keep them in position while the lawsuit proceeded. The room held its breath. Seconds stretched long. When the final vote was cast, the chamber erupted. For the Carters, the moment was surreal. Sitting quietly, holding each other's hands, they felt the weight of many names lift. Not just Elijah's, the names of every student whose voice had been muted without record. The names of children steered away from stages, silenced under policy, dismissed under prejudice. The victory was not only about a contest, it was about accountability, recognition, the possibility of change. Media coverage swelled again. National outlets picked up the story. Civil rights organizations praised the ruling as a landmark precedent. Educational watchdogs called for wider investigations in neighboring districts. Advocacy groups organized phone banks urging legislation for inclusive speech and education rights. For once, paperwork and truth had beaten fear and silence. Late that night, Tamara sat at the kitchen table with Elijah. The board's decision letter had arrived. The firing of officials was real. The district's internal email server was scheduled to be audited. A public apology draft circulated among trustees. The future seemed brimming with possibility. For every former plaintiff in dorm rooms working jobs, dropping out early, there was hope that this victory might echo into policy, funding, and real protection. But just as they began to let themselves believe, the unexpected arrived. That same evening, the postal door creaked. Tamara opened it to find a plain, unmarked envelope. Inside lay a single sheet of paper typed in blank font. No letterhead, no name, no signature. The content was short, a threat drenched in bureaucracy. It accused the plaintiffs of defaming dedicated educators, warned of irreparable consequences to community funding, and threatened private legal action if media coverage continued. The final line warned that the case could be quietly settled for the good of children and district reputation if plaintiffs agreed to cease public statements indefinitely. No bullet this time, no overt intimidation, no spectacle, just cold silence dressed in legalese. Tamara stared at the letter long after the door closed. The audacity hit her. The same system that had been exposed was now attempting to re-silence them, not with violence, but with fear, power, and threats of quiet ruin. Elijah read it too, calm on the outside, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. He closed his eyes for a moment. He had won. They had achieved what many said was impossible. But this letter was not about winning. It was a warning that triumph did not guarantee safety, that justice could be challenged, even when proven, that power didn't always disappear with exposure. It sometimes reconstituted itself in darker, subtler forms. The living room fell silent. Outside, the hum of traffic, distant horns, normal lives continuing. Inside, the paper trembled on the table, the words heavy with threat. The legal victory felt fragile, like a house built of glass. Beautiful, visible, vulnerable. Tamara folded the sheet carefully, placed it in the folder with the lawsuit documents. She looked at Elijah, eyes tired but resolute. In that glance was a promise, not of retreat, but of resistance. They would not be bullied into silence again. Not now, not ever. Because the lawsuit had shaken the district. It had dismantled walls. It had exposed corruption. It had given voices back. But the fight for justice was ongoing. The threat was real. The stakes remained high, and somewhere beyond the boardroom, beyond the cameras, someone powerful watched, waiting, calculating, ready to strike again. One last battle, and the speech heard around the world. The district's letter sat on the kitchen table, stark against the soft lamplight. It offered apology, compensation, reform, but only if Elijah and his allies agreed to silence. The offer reeked of control disguised as compromise. It assumed that peace could be bought with paperwork, that fear could be traded for closure, that wounds could be healed with hush. Tamara stared at the typed words and felt anger swell, cold and deep. Years of manipulation, slander, threats, exclusion. None of that would vanish behind a signature. The district was asking for their voice, their truth, their future, and in exchange they offered a softened image. Both of them understood, accepting would be complicit, refusing would be resistant. Elijah stood at the window that night, watching the city lights flicker against the dark sky. In the quiet, memories flickered. The auditorium stage where his voice cracked, the microphone taken from his hands, the bullet taped to an anonymous letter, the TSA room where he'd been detained as if his hearing device were a weapon, the social media vitriol, the forged evaluations, the names erased, but also the hidden microphone in his jacket, the leaked tape that broke silence, the documents gathered, the lawsuit filed, the officials fired, the crowd's roar when his name was announced. He understood now that his fight had never been just personal. It had always been necessary. He folded the district's letter and placed it inside a box filled with other artifacts, protest signs, media clippings, copies of the lawsuit, the torn note from his backpack, the audio CD from the retired teacher, photographs of silent victims. He locked the box and placed it on the top shelf, away from daily sight. Not as a hidden memory, but as a monument to what silence had tried to bury, and what truth had resurrected. Within 24 hours of rejecting the settlement, he received a call, not from a school, not a local news station, but from a national talk show known for hard conversations about race, disability, and justice. The producer's invitation was clear. Could he bring his story to a national audience? Could he deliver a speech that married personal pain with broader systemic injustice? Elijah didn't hesitate. He prepared a new speech, titled "I Was Born Silent, But I Won't Die Quiet." This time, the microphone would carry not a contest piece, but a testament. When the night arrived, he stood under bright studio lights watching the camera lens blink red. The audience before him was diverse: advocates, activists, ordinary people who understood what invisibility felt like. The host introduced him not with pity, not as a curiosity, but with respect. The air leaned in as Elijah took his place at the podium, speech folder held steady. His voice flowed, not pristine, not polished, but raw and powerful, shaped by years of moments where silence was the only instruction. He spoke of barriers built into rhetoric, policies disguised as support, systems structured to exclude not just by intent, but by default. He spoke of ears attuned to certain tones and tongues polished in standard English, and how those ears often ignored the voices that didn't fit the mold. He spoke of stolen opportunities, erased identities, and children who learned early that speaking clearly meant conforming to someone else's standard. But most of all, he spoke of resilience, of refusing the erasure, of reclaiming dignity, and of demanding that differences be heard, not muted. The studio remained still, breath held. When he finished, the applause started slowly, then spread. Social media ignited. Hashtags flared anew: non-silent, not voiceless, education for every voice, Elijah Carter speaks truth. Civil rights groups, educators, parents, disability advocates shared the speech. People across states reached out, sending stories of their own, experiences of being silenced in classrooms, marginalized in competitions, dismissed because of voice, accent, or disability. Emails poured into news outlets, demands to revisit school policies, calls for national reforms. The impact was immediate. The conversation that began in a suburban auditorium had become a national dialogue. Meanwhile, the district that once tried to buy silence found itself cornered. Donations from sponsors surged to civil rights funds. Several school boards publicly condemned the prior administration's practices. Proposals for inclusive speech education, mandatory unbiased evaluations, and oversight for IEP procedures were drafted in state legislatures. Sterling Pine's scandal became a case study. Educational seminars, panels, media segments, all dissecting how institutions fail when visibility is optional. The story outgrew one city, one student, one contest. It resonated with any voice ever told not to speak up. But with visibility came risk. Late one night, Tamara opened the door to find an unmarked envelope sliding under the mat. Inside, a simple note with no signature. Just one line. We watch. We wait. More chilling than before. Not a threat of blunt violence, but a warning cloaked in patience. Someone wanted silence now, not by bullet, but by fear. The slow, suffocating kind that creeps in after the lights go out and the cameras turn off. Elijah stood beside her, reading the note under the porch light. His face went still, the warmth of victory draining like water sliding through fingers. But he did not fold. He did not fear. Instead, he placed the note on top of the locked box of artifacts, the same box holding the district's rejected settlement. Then he flipped on the living room light, sat down at his desk, opened a new document on his laptop, and began drafting a letter, not of apologies, not of regrets, but of purpose. A letter to lawmakers, educators, activists, a call for national reform in speech education, for inclusion in competitions, for recognition of difference as strength, not as deficit. He wrote into the night, fingers trembling, not with fear but with determination. Outside, the city slept. Inside, a flame burned, small, steady, unyielding. The fight had changed shape again. It was no longer about one contest or one district. It was about truth, visibility, justice, about making silence too dangerous to ignore. And somewhere beyond the streetlights, behind closed doors, the watchers listened. The world has heard him. But will it listen long enough to change? If you believe every child deserves to be heard, not judged, not silenced, type yes in the comments. Have you ever seen someone punished just for speaking differently? Tell us below. Don't forget to subscribe. These stories aren't just content, they're a fight for truth. Because the only thing more dangerous than injustice is staying silent about it.